He's asking for a super quick rundown on the Anglo Ortho situation. Um, the thing is that Anglo Ortho is a guy with a YouTube channel, just like us, who showed up about a year ago, something. Um, and he participated in the American event, had a talk there, which I've heard went very well, and got in contact with a lot of the people who are on the American online dissident right. And then he disappeared for a while, and he came back, and he's been doing some streams and uh, some um, yes, not debates. He's just pretty much been streaming and doing some videos on his own channel, but it's of a radically different material. And I'll be honest, like you said, you don't want to, fight with him. I don't want to fight either. But you have to, like, if Anglo Ortho is listening to this, you have to make sense for more than 5 minutes at a time. You're saying things in one sentence, and in the next sentence, you're contradicting yourself or saying something completely different. And I don't know if it's you're trying to marry something that's not marryable or what you're doing, but like I don't understand what you're saying. Maybe I'm stupid, but I'm feeling if the for me it's like either this guy is about to paradigm shift the entire political theory, or I'm stupid, or he's stupid. And I feel like if I don't understand what he's saying, then what's the point? And it doesn't seem that anyone else is understanding what he's saying. So
Well, and I think that what the kind of core thing that the reason this is notable is someone who is, fairly prominent, not like one of the, the big like top tier names, but someone that kind of like was well known, disappears for, plus or minus a year. And his last appearance to my mind is a stream he did with the Distributist and a few other people, might have been Philos, I can't
yep.
remember who else, on what it was like being a liberal in the 2000s. And to me, I thought it was particularly insightful because I was, a child. I was growing up during this time. And so him describing the change in tone he felt during the Obama years, where kind of libs shifted from being people that he saw as being genuinely concerned to kind of this emergence of this, kind of like vindictive streak. It was a good stream. Like I really enjoyed it. And so it's almost like someone leaves or someone at one point, the last point of contact you have, you're like, okay, like I agree with that, like maybe you're a little bit to the left of me, but like we're kind of on the same page. Disappears
Yeah.
for the best part of a year and then comes back and is essentially become kind of like an IDW type centrist. And so my point is not that, like, obviously, like you were allowed, I'm not going to stop you from being an IDW type centrist, but it's a notable change. And it's especially odd to essentially, like, if you're, plotting this out as a graph, all of a sudden, you're missing data for a ton of months, and the
Yeah.
lines move to a radically different direction. It's on one hand, it's just,
Yeah, and
that's
then you
why it's
show up and
notable.
expect to be treated the same way, pretty much, right? Or
Right.
or
And I
to be
think the
able to
other
attack
thing,
everyone else who's been,
the
who's who's got clear data points for the past year.
Right. And I think the other thing is that I'm not like overly adverse to criticism. Like, I think that there are definite points of criticism to our movement and to the right wing in general. But there's another point where it's like, look, if you've been gone for, 6 to 8 months or whatever, and you come back and we're essentially rehashing points that were kind of decided, by this corner of the internet effectively years ago. Like this is essentially like where it's like a rerun of, 2018 talking points. You kind of look around and you're like, well, wait a minute, like, well, if this is really what you think, like, one, how did you end up here? But like, two, what's the point of sticking around? Like if you
Yeah,
want,
like why are you here to tell us that the moon landing definitely happened? Like what are you trying to accomplish?
and I think it's especially frustrating because there were many, I guess, initial premises that I was willing to hear him out on. Uh, and look, like I realize this might be scheduled for later in the chat, but one of the things he brings up is something I actually quite agree with, that you need to, in rejecting the left, you can't either reject everything, completely like out of hand, or, and this is why it's especially frustrating because it's not particularly coherent. He makes another point, which is that you can't enter into the left's framing. And so he specifically talks about the framing of the war between the sexes. The idea that, like, oh, well, if women hate men, well, if we just hate women more, we'll win. Like, obviously that's stupid, and that's something that you see,
I agree,
echoed.
but
And so that's
that's
a
my point. Like, who on the dissident right, beside like some
exactly,
weird guy, is saying that?
exactly. It's like these are points that are not incorrect, but not only are they not novel, but they're not particularly in dispute. And so essentially what it came out as, and this is a series of videos of which I've watched a little more than half of. I've watched the first and the last thing he did, the thing on the moon landing and then the thing on, race, which I think is the thing that we'll find the most objectionable. It's a lot of kind of like premises anyone would agree with, and then conclusions which are basically like basic bitch liberal conclusions. And so it comes to a point where it's like, well, what's the point of this? Like, why are you here? If you really think this, like, there is a vast network of people who agree with you. Like, if you're just a lib who the left them, like, my brother
Yeah,
in
well,
Christ.
there's tons of channels for you
Yeah,
out there.
exactly. Like, James Lindsay's right there. He will welcome you with open arms, and like, at a certain point, it's like, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen.
No, I completely agree with your statements there, and I mean, I did actually watch all of his videos, and I jotted down some points in terms of like certain things I wanted to respond to. It will be nothing like what the academic agent did, but like this super detailed thing. I mean, you mentioned it previously, Jay. I mean, he did cuck us a little bit. I mean, I planned to talk about this in advance, but he, like, the moon landing thing, he covered it extremely thoroughly, right? And
Who did?
academic agent
Oh, right.
with the
Sorry,
under the
I
microscope
missed that
video.
part.
That
Yeah.
was where he
Yeah,
did a
no,
response
I know.
video.
I just missed that. I think you cut out for me for a moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, but I mean, let's see. I mean, the reason for me why I took interest in this, and like you're saying, it's sort of it's like this feeling of someone who's come in the wrong door at a conference or something. Like, you weren't supposed to be here. You're supposed to be on the other floor, right? But that's like, that in itself is not the weird part for me. Like, the reason I think this is significant is because of Dave, the distributist, who has like multiple times recommended Anglo Ortho, and he put it out on his like distributist public Telegram. He wrote comments on his videos that were positive, and he said that like we need to have these discussions. And so I didn't want to do this because I think that Anglo Ortho is particularly interesting, but really more as like a proxy of like, these are things that Dave the distributist want to talk about, that I sort of see him as like this kind of premier heavyweight in our spheres. So like, that's why I thought it was interesting. And I did jot down a list here. See, the moon landing episode has been thoroughly covered already, and I thought that was the best thing Anglo Ortho made. We have a lot of points of agreement there, right? I sort of agree that people on the right with the right wing tend to go down this kind of almost Gnostic rabbit hole where you just like doubt everything and you think everything is fake.
Yeah.
And like, you can't deal logically with reality at that
That is
point.
something
It's
that
like,
we have talked about indirectly multiple times on this show, right? It's not about being the most right-wing guy in the room. It's about finding sustainable right-wing, modes of thinking. And let's take the moon landing stuff specifically, because as you said, once you start doubting one thing, you doubt everything. But the correct response, in my view, to like, did we go to the moon, isn't no, it's why should I care? Why should that be a part of my worldview? Like, it doesn't matter to
Yes.
me in my right wing mode of thinking whether we went or not, right?
And we have to pick our fights, right? I mean, what hills are worth dying on for the particular things we want to accomplish politically, and not just
which is why I think, and I feel that a lot of people are on the same page as me, not necessarily literally, but in that same ballpark, right? So when he shows up and starts lecturing us about, we totally went to the moon, guys, again, as you said, it's like he entered the wrong room.
But I think, like, again, I think this is the best video that he did, because the other ones are just way worse in that sense. I don't know like what other people are going to say when if they do more of these under the microscope videos. But I mean, there's another YouTuber I follow, Ramsey Pauls, who has had a similar sentiment about the moon landing and so on, and like, he attributes this to a kind of malaise in like the mindset of people, where they are starting to become so myopic and it's sort of introvert. I don't know the right term here, but they can't even, like, they didn't believe we we went to the moon because they didn't, they don't believe we can actually do that in reality, and there's this kind of cultural sick pessimism. But of course, I don't want to go down that tangent. This is the least controversial video, I think. But like the second episode he did in these right-wing critiques is the "You Don't Want a Based King" video, where he goes after two ideas. He says that the government that we have is actually good. It's actually a sort of a hunky-dory solution to have a constitutional republic. And like the problem is cultural, so you shouldn't focus on political solutions. There we go back to the kind of Gen X thing. And then he talks about like how it's actually bad to have a king, because then you wouldn't have property rights and you wouldn't be able to practice religion the way that you wanted. So it's actually a good thing to have cultural pluralism and so on.
Well, and that's the thing that I want to bring up is that many of these things are, very root level liberal presuppositions, and specifically about, feminism is one, democracy is another, believe the sources is another. And like, fair enough. Like, this is I hate to use this word, but like, this is a diverse coalition. And so I'm kind of willing to say like, all right, like one or two of these and you can still be, part of our group. But there comes to be a certain point where it's like, well, if you disagree with everything about this group, you're not a part of the group.
Yeah,
just like, by virtue of the fact of like just basic classification. Exactly. It's like being like, yeah, so I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in God. I actually, I worship Ahura Mazda. And oh yeah, no, the whole marriage thing. Yeah, I'm polyamorous. And yeah, I really just like, but I'm a pretty committed Christian. You come to the point where it's like we can talk about the specific claims you're making. That's a separate discussion, which I'm happy to get into. But if you meet none of the criteria for that group, you're not part of the group. This is like a very basic, like it's almost so stupid you don't have to say it. But
yes. But of course, I thought about this as well. Like if you're going to be dissident right, there are two qualifications. First, you need to be dissident. And secondly, you need to be on the right.
Exactly.
I mean, we talked about like the negative vision of clearing them out. I think like instead of having that as like the only vision we have, I think it should be a qualifier. Like, do you want to clear them out? Yes or no? And if you say no, then you're not in. Basically, that it should be it should be like the minimum requirement of what you need.
I mean, it's so weird. You mentioned the based king one, right? And you said that okay, yeah, property rights and free speech is good. In a vacuum, yes, sure, right? Even you could even say that's wrong, right? But let's just give him that these are good. But then his next follow-up to that is basically that, okay, if that's given as a good and you have that now, if you get like a based king, a based autocrat, a dictator, you can't guarantee that the things you think are good stick around, right? That you're going to prosper under the based autocrat. But I mean, I'm already suffering under the current system. So what choice do I have? Right? Like, I mean, that's the thing that I just used that as that's just step 1 and 2 of his argument in that video. And that's something that repeats in every video. I agree with the basic, like the very basic broad suppositions that he have. And then he goes off on a completely different tangent and says something completely stupid. And I'm sitting there wondering, why am I even listening to this guy? Why is everyone so up in arms about him? And I understand why, really, because Virginius de Flandria says, why can't we debate left-wingers instead? No, because it's important to patrol our own perimeter. More than it is to attack the enemy, actually.
Well, and the other thing that's so frustrating about this is that if this were some kind of like revolutionary, argument, like, oh, wow, I really hadn't thought of that. Like you're really like attacking the core tenets, but in a way that's productive. Like, fair enough, right? Like if I don't have an answer for it, then that needs to be examined. But like this is stuff that Hoppe covered, like democracy, the God that failed, like these kind of basic, defenses of democracy. Like we've been pretty, at least in my opinion, right? Like we've been pretty comfortable at, being firmly anti-democratic for quite a long time. It's not like these are new critiques.
No, exactly. And this is a part of his videos that I almost find, I mean, sorry to sound like I'm sort of triggered, but I find it slightly disrespectful because there's been discussions going on. We've been reading, Robert Filmer, Thomas Hobbes, Carl Schmitt, Hans Hermann Hoppe, Moldbug, and so on. Like there's a body of work in political science defending autocracies, basically, or monarchies, for various reasons for why they're good and why they're not good, in a sense. And like if you're going to contribute something to the DR as it stands, you're going to have to actually attack the steel man, like the actual academic work that's been done, and not attack like people on Twitter talking about the based king or whatever. So that's
it's a body of work. It's a canon, I suppose, to use a word that's sort of really strengthened over the past couple of years, and to just show up and sort of like start taking jabs without it just feels disrespectful towards that foundation.
Yes, and like the second thing with the premise is that the idea that you can't have property rights under an autocratic government. I don't know where that comes
that's just
from.
retarded.
You can have a constitutional monarchy. I mean, like there are autocracies in the world right now, whether it's like Russia or China or other countries where you can have property. I mean, they can take your property, but so can the current system. Like they can also expropriate your property. So it's like there's no reason why you can't have property rights. The same thing goes for like religious freedom. Typically, like an autocrat will target religious groups that they feel are a threat to them. It's not like they're going to just persecute every person who thinks differently than them. Like they don't have time for that. I mean, say in somewhere like Russia, for instance, where like Vladimir Putin is friendly with like the Russian Orthodox Church. And that's probably like the main religious group there. But you have, say, 5% of the population that's Muslim. They're not being constantly persecuted in Russia
because they're not a rival. Not a rival castle, right?
Exactly. I mean, if you're, if the autocrat is going to do anything to persecute you have to actually be a threat. And so some people in like Washington having a little commune where they have like this kind of Russian Orthodox thing in the United States. It doesn't matter if it's an autocrat or whatever. This is not a threat to the system in any way, particularly if they take the approach that politics is worldly and we're just going to focus on ourselves and like being virtuous and dressing correctly and not thinking bad thoughts and so on. Every king is going to leave them alone, right? They have no interest in people like that. They pay their taxes.
Then they're not going to be able to fight back when the FBI shows up at the door.
Exactly.
Right?
So they're absolutely no threat. Yeah.
And this is baffling to me because Hoppe demolishes this myth incredibly well. He basically puts forth, and look, I'm no ANCAP, but there's a lot of good in Hoppe. And he basically puts forth this point where his primary, I guess, variable he wants to maximize is property rights. So he's an ANCAP. He gets off on that. Mm-hmm. And so what he describes is basically like, look, like what is monarchy except for a system in which one person has ownership over the state? So they have a vested interest in essentially ensuring that their company turns out well because they're going to pass it on to their children. And because it is all kind of owned by one person, it actually limits the amount of overreach the government can have. Because whereas now, our governments essentially have limitless funds. They can employ thousands of bureaucrats, thousands of guys with guns to ruin your life. I mean, like if you actually look at what monarchies were really like the touch of the law was incredibly light just because it was one
There's
guy.
There's a physical limit to what you can do. Yeah,
exactly. And so that doesn't
even all the way down. I mean, that's the whole point of feudalism, is to separate, the violence into. It's to compartmentalize the violence potential, right?
No, exactly. And it's so bizarre to me because my big point with this is I'm not mad that Anglo Ortho is bringing up objections. Like that's part of the process. Like fair enough, do it. But
I'm mad that he's bringing up retarded objections.
Yes, exactly. And bringing up objections that have been handled 30 years ago, by people who are essentially to the left of this group. Like I would say that most of us are to the right of, of Hans Hermann Hoppe. But like, this is, to me, it's also like, these aren't obscure sources. Like Hoppe is cited continuously. We talk about anti-democratic, like if you want to look into this, like to me, at least, like the videos talking about this as a new issue are 4 to 5 years old. Like if you're going to inject yourself into the conversation, like do your research is kind of my point.
Yes, it's really well put. And you don't just have theory to back this up. I mean, if you look at the last like 2 years of COVID handling, I mean, if you compare, liberal democracies, the way they handled this thing to dictatorships, I mean, say like Belarus or Russia were significantly more lax on basically pushing masks in people's faces, locking people up, and all that stuff compared to Australia, for instance, or Germany, or some of these liberal democracies that were just way, way, way worse. So, I mean, simply by the fact that Putin is not really that interested in getting up in personal people's business, he's just more trying to handle geopolitical issues, and doesn't have the same kind of managerial apparatus that we have in the West. That is just standing over your shoulder, trying to monitor everything you're doing. So paradoxically, I mean, you have more personal freedom, in at least in some aspects,
Well,
living
look,
under
man,
dictatorships.
it wasn't that bad. I don't know why everyone's complaining about it. It wasn't that bad. Like, sure, I almost got kicked out of university. Sure, I faced major penalties because I wouldn't get the jab. Sure, I can't get a job in multiple industries because I won't get the jab. But it wasn't that bad, man. It wasn't that bad. You're just
Yeah.
making it up.
It's
Yeah,
hard to forgive Biden.
but I mean, then we're going into his like third episode, like the way of life, way of death, where he actually does make that claim, where just like you said, that like the COVID stuff wasn't that bad because he wasn't forced to take the vax, right? I mean, I was basically threatened, like with my job.
Yeah,
My
me
wife,
too.
who was pregnant at the time, was pressured. With the vaccine, I mean, we were able to get out of it because we have resources, right? And we could negotiate, and I have like leverage in my job. But I know people who lost their jobs because of this, like they refused to get jabbed, or they refused to wear masks, or like various things. A lot of these things, it happened to a lot of people. So I just don't understand. Like it's probably the most kind of like pants on head retarded take that he has. That is like, this wasn't an issue. Like, it's not something to fuss about because he wasn't affected by it. That he lives in, I think, Washington or something. That's a blue state, and he wasn't. His community wasn't targeted. Which, of course, fair enough. I think that a lot of Americans got off better. They were more capable of local resistance. But if you look at Europe and Australia and these places, I mean, it was just it was a horror show. It cannot be
Well,
downplayed.
and I don't want to just overpower the conversation, but I'm going to quote Charlemagne on this, who I should say is currently roasting me on Twitter right now for my bad tweet today. But nonetheless, like, he had this point where he's like,
you should be.
I can't even defend myself there. And then Eds got me acting
we'll chalk it
unwise,
up
but
to the no Nima November.
yeah, exactly. Right. My testosterone's off the charts. But anyway, what I meant to say is, he had this video where he brought up a point where he's like, look, like, if you really consider yourself a dissident, like, this is not an option. You cannot do this. And so I remember it was one of those moments where I almost was like I remember that moment incredibly well. Like, I was sitting there and it's like, oh, like, I'm going to have to do this, and I might actually have to take a hit on this. And so what happened is, I was very close to graduating with my degree when the actual when the actual enforcement came through. And basically it was like, well, all right, like, do I really believe this? Am I going to have to actually do it? Am I going to have to do something destructive to my life? Be forced out of school, be expelled. And basically I was like, all right, like, fine, we're going to do this. And so it was kind of like, and this is a much, much tamer version of this, obviously, but like, it's like, to a certain extent, it's like, it was almost like a mock execution, where what they did is they said, like, all right, we're going to kick you out. We're going to kick you out. We're going to kick you out. And then the day that they were going to kick me out, they sent an email that's saying, like, all right, if you've got a religious exemption, you're good to go. And it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, like, hell, it didn't affect me. Like, obviously, like, look, I was fine. I got my degree. But at the same time, like, that's a real thing. And, that willingness of people to, go right up to the line, like, point the gun at your head. But it's like, oh, man, they didn't pull the trigger. And it's like, well, nonetheless, I kind of resent the implication of it. And the idea that they have all that power, but it's not a big deal because they didn't actually shoot you, is, I think, kind of absurd.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're going to find very few people defending it, but I just don't think it's been discussed enough. I mean, people are talking about like the race stuff a lot more and just kind of overlooking it, because I think that's like the most grave thing that I've seen in his videos. This kind of downplaying of the COVID stuff. It's it is a little bit mind numbing I mean, you have lefties who are still like up in arms about this stuff, right? So
Still getting their like seventh jab or something, yeah.
Yeah, but like say like these old tankies and stuff that are been going kind of hard on the kind of anti-jab thing. So I mean, we don't want to. Not spending too much time on it, but there's like two more points. It's really like the race
let's
stuff.
Do the last, and then we can move into tie the thread with Movie Bob.
We're going into the dinner. So I mean, like the race part as well. It's really the same as the monarchist bit. There is so much kind of research, whether whether it's like Steve Saylor or what's the white guy, Jared Taylor. I mean, you have Taylor, so the bell curve, whatever you want to do. There's like so much, whether it's biology, stats. Data that you can take a look at, but instead of like going to trying to refute that, he basically boils it down to like the reason that the DR has a problem with, say, certain minority groups is because you've seen videos on Live Leak of like a black guy who's jerking off in Starbucks, right? And there's like, well, there are white people who's doing this as well. And like, I mean, there are actual arguments. There are like reasons people believe this stuff and believe that reconciliation is not possible outside of just having seen clips on Twitter, right? It's not just is sort of like gut reaction thing. There are real things that need to be tackled here. That's just kind of completely circumvented. And I mean, the problem that's sort of not just the idea that he is not willing to actually engage with the steel man, like the real literature, but he always sort of falls back to this kind of religious perspective of the free, like this kind of metaphysical free will. In a sense, what is the term? Like libertarian free will. I think that's the academic term. The idea that you have everybody just has absolute free will all the time, and then so everything has to then be brought into this very individualistic perspective that it's always coming down to individual choices. But
strange how often that appears in a generation as nihilistic as the Gen X, by the way.
But it's but I mean, I think for people like Anglo, it's like they sort of feel like the the kind of consumer culture wasn't authentic enough, so it had to end with a religious conversion instead of a type of suicide, like a Kurt Cobain or something like that. But let's see, where was I? Yeah, with the free will point, is that the problem is that there's been so much work done in terms of like sociology, political science, biology that needs to be used to kind of understand political phenomena at a large scale, because no matter how like what you talk about free will, a group of 10 people is different than one person. A group of 1,000 people is different than a group of 10, and a group of 1,000,000 people is different than 1,000 people. There are certain laws and things that you have to consider when you're dealing with like very large scales of people in terms of how to organize, how to communicate, like this is what the elite theory is about, like how to basically get power in very large systems. This is where like the Pareto principle comes in. It's not just like a question of individual will. There is like actual ways that you can scale up systems and understand how power is distributed in systems, that if you're just going to go with this free will thing, like you're just kind of disregarding it in a sense. Like you can't even have that conversation, because you can always just bring it back to some individual should have made some choice at some point that they didn't do, and therefore we need to foster a better culture to encourage better use of free will or something. And of course this is it's all well and good, but it seems more to me like what he's trying to do is be like a missionary for Russian Orthodoxy and not really a political commentator, in a sense. That's kind of seeming, that is kind of like the final impression that I'm getting here, is that he is sort of having a little bit of credentials inside of the dissident right, going out of it, spending time in the sort of Russian Orthodox ministry, coming back in as a sort of missionary character, trying to win people over. And as most modern missionaries in first world countries, being wildly unsuccessful and just completely off point on like everything. So I don't know if anyone of you have like a similar take to that.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't want to read in too much this guy's motives, because again, like he seems like a nice enough chap, and I'm not just trying to like gut him. But to me, the core of my complaint about his, his stuff on race is not only what you've brought up, because it's all right, but he uses this analogy that I think is fundamentally incorrect, where he starts off describing his kind of like anti-feminist quote unquote position, which is basically that like feminism sells you this anti-male position. And obviously,
oh God, I know where you're going with this. Yeah, sorry.
And obviously you need both men and women to be on good terms for society to function, right? Like becoming unironic, like woman haters to own the libs is stupid. Fair enough. I agree with that. I think most people would. But he turns that around to say, well, much like women and men must be on the same terms. Well, that's just how races are. Like men and women are just as different as, the races are. And look, regardless of what your ultimate solution for race relations is, that's a pants on head retarded analogy. Because to be honest, like,
and it happens within like 3 sentences too.
Yes,
I don't know how he does it.
And I was sitting there and I actually scrubbed back through it. I was like, wait a minute, he didn't go there. And he does, and I'm not misrepresenting him, but he basically likens men and women to different races. And my point is, not only is that not true, regardless of your solution for race relations, but I mean, can you name one society?
You can't equivocate those things. That's just not how it works.
One society where men and women haven't interacted?
Yeah.
No, you can't. Can you name a society where different races haven't interacted?
Yes.
Yes, you can. And that doesn't mean that they're good societies, but it does mean that your analogy doesn't work. It just falls apart. And to me, it's like, it's frustrating because I get what you mean, Luddick. And I'm realizing I'm treading a, delicate line here, being a Christian, and I'm not trying to, criticize him for that. But it does almost seem like it's almost so disconnected with this community. It's so unrelated to what's really going on that it does kind of seem like the youth pastors, walked into the college dorm, flipped the chair around backwards.
Hey kids.
Yeah, exactly. Like, hey kids, so you like Tupac? Like stuff like that. Like, it's just like, hello, fellow kids. And again, like, I'm not trying to impugn this guy personally. He seems like a nice enough guy. I'm sure we could get along with, I could get along with him great, but it just does seem radically disconnected.
Well, I think, it's good that the community as a whole and the big names as well have reacted the way that they do, and sort of like, the alpha wolf snapping at the upstart, because as I said, it's patrolling our own perimeter is actually more important than attacking the enemy at this point. So
yes, I mean, in relation to the comment that came up like almost half an hour ago, why not debate leftists? I mean, debate is for people within our spheres. That's the only reason we have them, to figure stuff out between ourselves. We can only have debates between people of good faith who have similar goals, who try to reach them. I mean, like, debating leftists, there's absolutely no point. What do you get out of debating someone like Vosh? It's just like clout chasing and trying to out edge and outflank the other person, make them look bad. There's nothing productive that I've seen ever come out of like this kind of right wing left wing debate ever.